the Prime Minister and his cohorts, they went after many other people subsequently. Over 100 people lost their OCIs. The OCI is fundamentally a visa, and no court can really interfere with the executive's power to grant visas. And so you find yourself in a kind of group of people who can't come back to older parents, who can't have any access to their country. A huge part of your life becomes almost entombed.
The government says you hid the fact that your father was Pakistani, when in fact you have written books where you've acknowledged he was the well-known Pakistani politician Salman Taseer.
What the government knew, they knew from my books, and they even quoted my books back to me. I did have a Pakistani father, but only one I'd met when I was 21. And the Prime Minister knew very well, my mother had covered him. She's a journalist in India, and she'd covered him for many years. And so he knew her personally. This is the kind of absurdity that I feel an authoritarian regime almost thrives on. This is what we call Kafkaesque, when the rules don't make sense or the rules don't match the reality.
Hello and welcome to a new edition of Tipping Point with me, Harinda Babeja. I'm being joined today by author Aatish Taseer, who has written 7 books. His latest, A Return to Self, grapples with the complexities of home and belonging and nationhood after he was denied access to a country that he was brought up in, a country where his mother continues to live. The book is raw and personal, and I plan to keep my questions raw and personal too. Welcome, Aatish, and thank you for speaking to the Quint.
Thank you, Harinda. It's lovely to speak to you.
Let's get straight to the politics, Aatish, because that's how your book begins. You say on November 7, 2019, the government of Prime Minister Narendra Modi revoked my Overseas Citizenship of India, effectively banning me from the country I grew up in. It was the Prime Minister himself who did not want you to step foot on Indian soil?
I think it was probably Amit Shah. I think it was his number 2. I think everyone was pretty clear that this action was coming from the Home Ministry, even the consular services here, as well as the External Affairs Ministry. And anyone who's tried even to get me a tourist visa quickly realizes that the origin of the action is Amit Shah, which is about as close to Mr. Modi as you can get.
We do know that you wrote a cover story for Time magazine calling Prime Minister Modi India's divider-in-chief. And in the introduction, you say, and you quote Prime Minister Modi saying, Time magazine is foreign. The writer has also said he comes from a Pakistani political family. That is enough for his credibility. And then you say, right, after that, my days in India were numbered. I had been recast as an outsider, an alien, a Pakistani. What did you feel when the doors just, shut firmly on your face? It's a very difficult thing to deal with.
It happened. It's funny that we're talking now because I'm in Greece. I was in Greece exactly 6 years ago when that happened. And I remember my mother saying, she's like, you've sort of committed the crime of hubris, and now there's sort of nemesis, revenge or punishment that's to come. And I didn't know at the time. I think there was a lot of panic, a lot of frenzy, a lot of wish to kind of get a handle on the situation and maybe find some way. And as the years went by, everything became a lot colder because it became clear that even something as simple as a tourist visa was not to be given to me. And the Prime Minister and his cohorts, they went after many other people subsequently. Over 100 people lost their OCIs, and in those cases far more transparently, using sort of the rules of the OCI to kind of keep them out. And so you find yourself in a kind of group of people who can't come back to older parents, who can't have any access to their country. A huge part of your life becomes almost entombed. It is painful. It is painful, and I feel like it's a pain that I haven't even looked at quite squarely, because I still, how sometimes they say like that rage is the face of grief, and I think like I still feel so much anger that I think probably I haven't confronted the more emotional side of it, the sense of loss, the sense of alienation, of kind of growing old in a country that I didn't expect to necessarily grow old in. A lot of modern lives are like this, where you have maybe a life here, but I was back to India 3 and 4 times a year, sometimes for a month at a time, and so all of that's over now.
You say you became a Pakistani and a Muslim in the eyes of the Modi government. Did you never consider contesting the OCI cancellation? Number one. Number two, I mean, suddenly Pakistani and Muslim have become bad names.
Yeah. Well, to answer your second question, I think that the Pakistani was always used as a kind of whistle or a dog whistle to sort of indicate Muslim. And the Prime Minister knew very well, my mother had covered him. She's a journalist in India, and she'd covered him for many years. And so he knew her personally, still does. So he knew the circumstances of the situation, which is that, of course, I did have a Pakistani father, but only one I'd met when I was 21. And my entire upbringing and entire life had been in India. So he himself personally knew the ins and outs of that situation. The OCI is fundamentally a visa, and no court can really interfere with the executive's power to grant visas. And so, somebody like Ashok Swain, who won his case and even got his OCI back, they slapped a travel ban on him almost immediately. And so and in my case, I was a sitting duck because, of course, the circumstances of my situation were difficult. They could have denied me based on the rules of the OCI of what I had, unless I had sort of some latitude to explain the particularities of my situation. It was very easy for the government to take the action that it took.
You refer to your mother. I must mention that Tavleen Singh, a renowned journalist, is your mother. And you lost your grandmother and you were not able to come for her last rites. The government says you hid the fact that your father was Pakistani, when in fact you have written books where you've acknowledged who your father is. He was the well-known Pakistani politician Salman Taseer.
Yeah, I mean, it was such a strange thing because if I was trying to hide, it was a very strange kind of hiding, because I went to such a great extent to make clear every detail about my circumstance. And in fact, what the government knew, they knew from my books, and they even quoted my books back to me without realizing the kind of lunacy of the fact that if I was trying to hide this, I would not publish it. This is the kind of absurdity that I feel an authoritarian regime almost thrives on. This is what we call Kafkaesque, when the rules don't make sense or the rules don't match the reality. That produces that kind of surreal atmosphere of a Kafkaesque book.
Aatish, you mentioned that the Prime Minister is in touch with your mother. He does reach out to her. She's a well-known journalist. She's often critical of him, and she often is in praise of him. I mean, he likes to be in touch with her, but he wants to have nothing to do with you.
Well, exactly. And he sort of stonewalled her for many years. And then my grandmother died, and suddenly, the office of the Prime Minister was frantically in touch. They wanted to send my mother a letter of condolence. And I tried to tell her that this was kind of the vanity of a strong man and not to get her hopes up, because she thought it might be an opening in which and she wrote to him, and she wrote this very emphatic letter trying to explain what had happened in my case. And of course, there she was met with silence again. And then recently my stepfather had a stroke and he was in touch again. But this is the kind of thing that I think like a certain kind of regime almost enjoys. And it's cruel because, she's a woman in her 70s. Her partner is now has had a stroke. I think she'd very much like her son to come and go from her life. I'm her only son, but there's not really any opening of that kind. And so I feel quite sad in the way that he sort of toys with her.
In your book, you write about being a love child. You talk about how your mother, Tavleen Singh, met your father, actually when she'd gone to do an interview with him, and then they disappeared for 1 week. You've not had the normal childhood that most children take for granted.
No, to say the least. No, I haven't. Every writer, I feel, has these sort of set of special circumstances, and I have mine. But I have to emphasize how much I was compensated in India by the love I received from my grandparents, from my parents, from my extended family. It was a very, very secure upbringing, and I don't think that it left me wanting anything. When I went to sort of find out the truth about my father and his Pakistani family, it was because I didn't want this sort of sense of absence to kind of dominate my life, to sort of dictate the sort of, I didn't want to be sort of handicapped by that absence. And so I went to kind of like to seek him out. But it wasn't because I felt like unloved or alone, or, India was very, very full, very rich, and the embrace was very warm.
While we're on the subject of your father, what was the kind of relationship that you shared with your father, Salman Taseer?
In that first meeting when I met him, there was a kind of mutual curiosity, and I remember he said to me, he said, "Is there anything you want to ask me?" And I realized like there were many things I did want to ask him, but I was so sort of overpowered by the physical presence of seeing this person that had almost acquired a kind of mythical role in my life. I was almost kind of dumbstruck by the sort of power of this massive connection. It's not like an uncle or an aunt, it's your father, and you've never met him, and suddenly there he is in another country, in another society, with a family of his own. And so it was hugely overwhelming for me. Then as we got to know each other, he sort of became, I'd grown up with a single mother, very liberal, very free, very, very, very much allowing me to be my own man. And he was very quickly quite domineering, quite patrician. He had these very sort of strong ideas of the Taseer name and what I could say and what I couldn't say. And so I found the atmosphere, it became very quickly suffocating.
He died a violent death, shot by his own bodyguard for defending a Christian woman accused of blasphemy. Was the news of his death a painful moment? How did you deal with that? I mean, at the end of the day, he was your father.
No, it was an unbelievable thing. I think even if you were not related to the man, it was an unbelievable thing, because here on a cold, dismal day in January, he was shot dead by his own bodyguard. And the bodyguard became a killer. There's a shrine to my father's killer in the hills of Islamabad where people come and give money and, treat him like a saint. And my father became this vilified symbol of Western decadence, somebody who even to the people from the senior leadership of his party wouldn't come to his funeral. And within months, my half brother was kidnapped. And for me, there was this surreal atmosphere that, like, because I'd written my first book and he was angry from it, again, I was denied any kind of right of closure or like anything that made the fact of his death real. So the whole thing was like, there's no way that any normal person could assimilate that kind of atmosphere. And I think probably my relationship with my sister, his daughter, has in some ways grounded that reality, has made it real. It allowed me to kind of to bring it into my life, into the normal flow of time. I guess because I'd had this surreal experience of this man who I didn't know, who then died this heroic death. And there was all these news reports and, Hillary Clinton mourning him and the Pope mourning him and saying a prayer for him in the Sistine Chapel. When V.S. Naipaul said to me, he said, "How are you doing?" I must have started to answer in a rehearsed way, in the way that I was trying to mourn him the way other people were mourning him. And then Naipaul sort of stops me short and he's like, "You must remember, he was also your great enemy, your father. And so you must be relieved that he's dead." And I was just completely I couldn't believe, like, it was like somebody sort of slapped me across the face. I was just suddenly felt the power and the truth of these words. I thought only somebody like V.S. Naipaul with that searing vision of honesty and truthfulness could like offer an absolution of sorts, a way for me to like express an emotion that is so unusual because people don't usually feel relief at the death of a parent.
But your father was not your great enemy, was he? Is that how you perceive him to be?
I think what he meant was that when I thought of my father, there was this feeling, a little bit of dread, because there was on the level of sexuality, I knew that he was violently prejudiced against it. So I'd never been able to come out to him, and I would have been very afraid to. The relationship was always convulsed. And so whenever I thought of him as this kind of heavy presence in my life, who I was at times estranged from, and who at the time, who I also like had a lot of sympathy for, because, the last time I met him was the night Benazir Bhutto was killed. And it was just one of those really chilling moments in the life of Pakistan where you see this sort of spirit of sacrifice. I think Imran is in that situation now, where these people give their life for this country, and there's this incredible futility, incredible violence. And I saw my father kind of registering the shock of having lost this person who his whole political career had been tied to. And within 2 years of that death, he himself would be dead, in not such a dissimilar fashion. I remember this journalist in Pakistan, Hamid Haroon, saying to me, he said, he quoted a line from Macbeth, and he said of my father, he said, nothing became his life like the leaving it. And in that final moment, he was glorious. You know, he died a death that was out of Greek mythology almost. And so I had to kind of balance the difficult personal relationship and the acknowledgement of his courage and his bravery, you know, and his willingness to look the mullah and the TV presenter and all that kind of lunatic atmosphere that can be generated in Pakistan. He was really able to look it squarely in the face and not be cowed. And very few people are like that.
And maybe you get that from him because you're not cowed either.
But I don't have that kind of courage. I don't want to die for a country. I want to live my life. Like no, I very much don't want to be drawn into those grand narratives. I think any country that demands the sacrifice of its bravest people for the country, like that enterprise will end in futility, whether it's Russia, whether it's Pakistan. That is not how countries get to better places, by people dying. You know, it comes from people living and contributing, and from the society nurturing them.
You speak honestly, you know, you speak in emotional terms as well. And your writing wrenches the heart. I mean, where you say, to lose one's country is to know an intimate shame, like being dismissed, disowned by a parent, turned out of one's own home. Do you believe that India for you is now a completely closed chapter?
I have to look at it like that, because honestly, like there's a kind of the state of exile. I think this writer Hisham Matar describes it as a state of perpetual waiting, and I don't want to be in that limbo. I don't want to have had my life go by while I'm holding out hope that I could come back to India, or you know. So I've kind of had to harden my hide to accept the fact that maybe this will be the case. At the same time, you know, what it does when somebody, you know, I remember Arif Muhammad Khan saying this, that, you know, if somebody says to you, कि आपका बाप नहीं है, you say, you know, dafa ho jao, like go to hell. Like what do you mean? Like, of course it's my fault. So it's this feeling of having to launch a defense for your life. You know, I grew up in India. I have family in India. You knew me when I was young in India. I have all of this reservoir of experience of relationships. And suddenly you're faced with sort of a government saying, well, you're not this thing. Yeah, it undermines the life that you've lived.
So, I mean, a piece of paper can't really change the person that you are or change the feelings that you have for a country. In your case, India.
It can to some extent, actually. I think that, you know, there are many states of travel, of limbo. Maybe you go on a holiday. Maybe you become an immigrant. But being an exile is a completely different experience. That feeling of a road being closed, of not being able to re-enter it, of home. You know, in India, we have so much internal migration, and people often say, you know, मैं गाँव जा रहा हूँ. And there's this feeling of like, I may have come to the city, but there's this integral idea of home somewhere else, which I can always return to. But if you say to somebody, you know, you can't go to the gaon, or the home in that fundamental way is over for you, it completely alters your reality. You live in a different way than you did before.
Let me ask you a straight question. Your name is Aatish Taseer. It could have been Aatish Singh or just Aatish. What makes you continue calling yourself Taseer?
I mean, it's just, you know, there's that wonderful line in The Crucible where they want him to renounce his name at the end of Arthur Miller's Crucible. And he says, it's my name. It's all I have, you know? It's so fundamental. Like, I didn't choose it. I wasn't part of the process that made me Aatish Taseer. In fact, my middle name is Ali, and it was given to me by my Sikh grandmother, because she said, you know, Aatish bada garam naam hai, Ali rakh dete hain. You know, like, and that was part of that kind of weird mili-juli tehzeeb of, you know, of undivided India that my grandmother was part of. And so all of this has come down to me. But once it becomes yours, I feel like it would be, I don't know, an act of such betrayal to say, uh, oh, well, sure, I'll get rid of it. Why not? You know? And also, I think the mistake you make is that when you're faced with that atmosphere of being asked to make concessions based on your identity, of asked to surrender parts of yourself, the people who are asking you to do that are never satisfied. And that's one of the things that comes up in this book, the convivencia of Spain, which is like our Mili Juli Tehzeeb, where there were Jews and Muslims and Christians, all part of Spain. They kept asking the Moriscos to say, to be convert, to do all of this stuff. But every time they did something, they actually became even more suspicious. And finally, they were chased out of the country. So that logic of the Inquisition, of which we have a shade of in India, that logic is never satisfied. And so the best thing you can do is to hold your ground, because otherwise you'll be completely annihilated.
So I'm holding up the book once again, A Return to Self, in which you write about how you killed aspects of yourself in order to fit into Indian life. What were the aspects that you actively killed?
The most obvious was sexuality. I was living in an age where gay men were living much fuller lives. I live in a world where I don't even remember that I'm married to a man, or it's so commonplace a fact of life. My rights are protected. I'm so assimilated a part of society here. And I had in that great age of optimism for same-sex love, I'd lived with that feeling in India that I was not going to have it, because it would make me more marginal in India. And I would be, already I was half Pakistani, illegitimate. And I thought, like, now you add gay, you're going to be like just a complete outsider. People won't, like a freak. People won't know what to do with you. But there were also, like, in very subtle ways that include all kinds of people. I think, in India, sometimes to be part of the grand narrative, we sacrifice so many of our curiosities, of our interests, of the quirkiness of our personalities. There's this feeling of kind of sacrificing the individual for the group. And I think that I was sort of in subtle ways already taking that on. And probably most importantly, which is a question that comes up in the book, was that my early support or early sort of enthusiasm for Mr. Modi was part of that, because I felt this groundswell of emotion in this country that was sort of propelling him forward. They even called it Leher hai. And I felt the need to be part of that. And I wonder how much that need came from not wanting to be marginal, or for wanting to compensate for my upbringing. So that's another aspect of the sort of thing that kind of cutting away of the individual to be part of the group.
You're now very open about your sexuality, about being. At what point, at what stage did you feel that, this is not something I need to hide? This is not something I need to be ashamed about?
I'd actually, in my early 30s, to this architect who I was with in India, and he was with me when my father was killed. And I remember him feeling, or when we broke up, of him feeling that I had undercut the relationship by a kind of inborn pessimism, that given there was so much possibility that men could get married to men, they could have lives, they could have children, they could have this very full life. I had carried with me a kind of pessimism that had eventually undermined the relationship. And I kind of swore to myself after that I would not do that again. That if I was met with somebody who was optimistic about life and imagined the life for us together, and I liked that person, that I would not let this pessimism kind of bring it down. And, the year Ryan and I got married was the year of the Obergefell judgment, which extended same-sex marriage, the right to same-sex marriage, to all 50 states here. And so it has been an absolutely, like, these 10 years of my life have been the happiest years of my life, because I've had so full a life in some ways. I've had domesticity, I've had, watching television together, I've had going to parties together, I've had just that feeling of normalcy. And I've seen many times a lot of close friends in India who have had those aspirations, and because the society doesn't legitimize the relationship, it can create a weakness within the relationship that wasn't there. Because actually you do need that. You need the inner strength of a relationship, but you also need its outside expression, because otherwise it becomes too hard. Already love is hard, relationships are hard. The last thing you need to do is to kind of, be campaigning for your relationship in the world beyond. That should be easy.
I'm glad you've conquered that one, Aatish. In the book, you describe the return to self, and I quote, "I woke up one day to find the bars of my prison had magically disappeared. With the idea of home gone, I stepped out into the world again." Can you describe the moment, the realization? How did you let the idea of home go?
It was a very strange process because, I have a very narrow idea of home. Home is my address. Home is the life that I built with my husband. It's my little chocolate lab, and I think that it's this funny thing. We have this mystical idea in India of home, of we're always responsible to be, we always try to make ourselves worthy of India, but we never ask what India should do for us. And, in America, it's very different. People give very concrete reasons. They live in a place. Everything is an act of agency. They make home, and home has to kind of level up. Home has to be answerable. So it's a very different relationship. After being exiled, one of the fears that came up was like, how am I going to carry on as a writer? If you take a writer, even like Salman Rushdie, who after 30 or 40 years of being away from India still writes so much about India. Kundera calls it the understructure of your creativity. And this thing for me was 100% India. And so I'd also had my material taken from me as a writer. And on the other side, I was out in the world, and I was so at home in the world. When I was traveling, whether it was in Muslim Spain, whether it was in Mexico, whether it was in Uzbekistan, I was traveling so profoundly as an Indian. I was traveling as somebody who had always balanced 2 or 3 societies in his head. I was traveling as someone who lived in a syncretic culture, someone who had a feeling for those little points in history that resonate into the present. I'm sure that a European or Western or an American traveler would not have that same experience. I had a historical sensitivity. I was so comfortable among different kinds of people, and not just that binary of India and the West, but like other places to which India had much deeper connections. And so that was the feeling of freedom, because it was like, wow, the world exists. And here I am listening to stories and being a writer. And once again, there's a little way forward for me.
In the end, I must ask, Aatish, none of us is immortal. One day we will all go. One day we will all die. Do you worry about not being able to see your mother enough, not being able to be there when she needs you or when she might need you?
I mean, very much so. It's all happening in real time. My stepfather had a stroke in November. I wasn't there. She's now contemplating a second stage in life in Delhi, where she's an older woman. And that relationship for me, it was even more than a parent relationship. It was a friendship. We talk all the time. We have political differences, but we're just, we've just known each other all our lives. Like there's a kind of like a real, it's not always that your parent becomes a kind of friend in later life. And I feel like her grief. I think she's very brave herself, and she would never sort of be sentimental about it. But yeah, there is this tremendous sense of fear of not being able to be present for someone who is present for you. And it feels like betrayal. And she's not able to. She's completely devoted to life in India. She wouldn't be able to start again in the West. And so there is this feeling of her dying and my not being there, or of receiving a call from someone saying, your mother's gone, and there being again that absurdity. And also there's the fear of later of me dying alone in this country with all these gaps and distances and absences that I haven't been able to make a whole of.
Thank you very much for being honest. All the best with your book. Thank you, Aatish.